Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So today we will cover this article called Framing Modern Monetary Theory, and basically the article explains that even though modern monetary theory is a very superior alternative to modern macroeconomic theory, it is not at all widely accepted. In fact, most places continue to teach macroeconomics, which has been proven wrong in the global financial crisis. So the question, the article is about why this is the case, why MMT is not accepted, and how we can change things. How can we make it accepted? So this is our goal for today. I will cover just this one article, and next time we will cover Paul Romer's article called Trouble with Macroeconomics. Paul Romer was actually one of the inventors of modern macroeconomics. So people who have said that he's talking as if this is somebody else's job, but actually the state of modern macro is also quite substantially due to Romer, and his texts are currently being taught all over the world. All right. So the first thing to understand is that macroeconomics is massively important. The newspapers are full of news about macroeconomics. Inflation, deficit, trade gap, exchange rate, interest rates. Every newspaper you pick up, you will find that. Now the thing is that all of these terms are very technical, not easy to understand, and you cannot understand any one of these things in isolation. Is inflation high? Is it low? This has to be understood both within the context of the whole economy and also within the context of some theory of economics which says whether you should have inflation or not, and so on. So a large amount of knowledge is needed. You have to have the domestic economic environment, the international economic environment, and economic theory. All three are needed to have a good understanding of what these terms mean and whether they are what we should do about these things. So unfortunately, the public has no idea of all of these issues, and more than that, they have the wrong ideas about many of these concepts, and because of that, the discussion in the newspaper is often full of nonsense. And furthermore, this problem is made worse because there are many so-called experts who give their opinion in a sort of a very authoritative way, so that people are deceived into thinking, yes, this must be true. These experts include people who have PhDs in economics but have no concept of modern macro. So they are saying things which have no relation to reality, but because they have PhDs in economics, people think that yes, this must be true. So even deeper problem, that first of all there are some blunders and mistakes and misunderstandings, but there is also deliberate deception going on. People are trying to actually mislead the public about the nature of economics. So there is this concept of power knowledge, which says that basically how power is expressed is not by the means of arms and not by the means of brute force. It is usually expressed by what is called soft power. So by deceiving people. So Karl Marx actually said that capitalism works in exploiting laborers not by, by forcing laborers to work, but actually by convincing them that what their exploitation is good and necessary and essential for the system to work, and is so basically by convincing them that this is the best policy for everybody, including themselves. So basically this is how capitalism works today also. Today Pakistan is poor and backwards and on the verge of getting loans from foreigners in foreign currencies which will have to be paid back. Why? Is it because there is something wrong with the economy? No, it's because people who make policy have the wrong ideas about what needs to be done, and so they take loans when it is unnecessary, and they allow free trade, collapsing our own industries because they think that is what is recommended, and they export raw materials instead of protecting our own industries because they say no, protection leads to damage. They don't allow government to regulate because they say that will be against perfect competition, and so on and so forth. 1,000 different policies are undertaken which are either irrelevant or harmful to the interests of Pakistan. So, and this is not. This is because these policies which are harmful to the interests of Pakistan are helpful to the interests of the rich and powerful. Today the game is not between countries. It's not really that America is trying to exploit us anymore. It was once the case. But now the game is in the hands of the big multinationals who have financial power and control the whole world, including the USA and Pakistan. So they are running all the countries and they are running the show, and things are being done according to their interests and desires, and against the interest of the American public as well as the Pakistani public. So how does this so power is not by atom bombs and by armies. Today power is by knowledge. By feeding minds with wrong types of knowledge, you can make people carry out your desire without actually even telling them anything or even talking to them or paying them. They are your agents. People are standing up and saying, yes, government is bad and it should be out. What is the business of government and free markets? And they have never been recruited by the forces of capitalism. They are just parroting things that they have heard which make sense to them. So how did this happen? There is this important study by Polanyi, and I will actually assign that to you to study on your own. It's called The Great Transformation, and basically this is also mentioned in this article in a different way. Basically what Polanyi says is that up until 16th, 17th century, in England, markets were subordinate to society. The whole society works, and markets are a small piece of society. But then, due to long and complicated circumstances, the markets took over the society, and the society became embedded within markets. And so, one thing to understand is that market norms and social norms are dramatically opposed to each other. We have discussed this many times, that if we say that we need blood to save some people, many people will stand up and volunteer, if we say, I want to buy blood for 1,000 rupees a pint, most people will not. And those people who do will be of different type of people from those who volunteer. So social norms and market norms are drastically different. So what the point of the great transformation is that you can't have peaceful coexistence if either one will win or the other will win. Either market is subordinated to the society or society is subordinate to the market. So today we are living in a society where the markets dominate. So today, Annie, my wife was telling me that at Shefa they ask Aga Khan, they ask a question that suppose, it's a common question for testing morality, that suppose that your wife is dying and you go to the market and you ask for a medicine which you need to save her, and you have 1,000 rupees, the cost of the medicine is 500, but the shopkeeper is charging 2,000 rupees. So is he entitled to do this? So today the majority think that yes, the shopkeeper has the right to ask whatever price, because that's the market norm. It's not the social norm. But so today the dominant thinking is that yes, it's his property, he can charge whatever price he wants. The other person can't pay, and if his wife dies, then that's too bad. So this is the effect of the great transformation. Today one of the people in the same type of interview, one of the doctors was asked that what will be, there's this field of epidemiology, what will be the result if there is an epidemic in the city of some disease? So he said, well, the doctors will have a lot of income. So this is the kind of thinking that has come into being in previous times. In the times that when I was growing up, a doctor would not be able to say in public that I am learning medicine because I want to make money, because this was considered to be a very cheap thing to do, and nobody, even if people were motivated by this, they would not say this in public because it would be a shameful thing to do. Now if a person says I am going into medicine because I want to serve humanity, people will laugh. So this is the effect of the great transformation, which has affected our society as well. It's a disease which is infecting our society and the minds and hearts of our young people, old people, all of them. This disease is very harmful for your own health, for your spirit, for your soul. The search for money is poisonous. But and to make yourself and make your life be governed by the search for money is to just cheapen yourself, to make yourself a commodity, which this education is designed to do. Because unless you think of yourself as something for sale, you will never be able to participate in the labor market. And the capitalism wants everybody to be part of the labor market. So the problem of deception is compounded by the market society, and the market society spreads ideologies which favor the top 1%. So, for example, the idea that the capital gets its marginal product and the laborer gets their marginal product, so it's sort of fair that everybody gets what they contribute. First of all, theoretically this is not true, but next of all, this is not actually a symmetric transaction. It's not that the capitalist is getting his share and the laborer is getting his share. Even though it is made to look like that. This is part of the deception, the soft power. actually the laborer is selling his life in order to earn money to feed his family. The capitalist just owns a machine. This ownership concept, why should, in fact, this is exactly what Karl Marx said. The main message of Marx is that these capitalists make money by their ownership of the machine, so they should not be allowed to own machines. All machines, all industry should be property of the state, so that nobody can exploit others. This is a very simple and clear, because it is the machine which is profits. So maybe we can put some money into the machine, but why should somebody who owns a machine get the benefits from the machine? So this is just a way of thinking that has become so dominant that it's hard for people to imagine. For exactly the same reason, Islam prohibits the interest payment, because basically Islam says that all payment should be made, a payment is halal if it is made in return for something which is productive for society. So ownership of money is not a productive act. So ownership of money, it by itself should not entitle you to get returns. Now capital is different from money, because actually a machine is actually valuable, and similarly land. So these issues become more complicated in such situations. But anyhow, the point is that there is an ideology which justifies the payments to the rich, and in fact in your micro course you will see that people argue that if somebody is a millionaire, it means that this is the value of this is value to society. If somebody is very poor, that means that he is not worth anything to the society. So one of the things that the classical economists used to talk about was the rentier, the person who earns rents, the landlord. He does nothing productive, but he earns rents. So one of the things that they emphasized was that you have to reduce the rents, because when productive effort gets rewarded, then the economy does well, because then people try to produce, and the more rents there are, the less production takes place, because the people who are producing earn very little, because the return that they get is captured by the rentier. So exactly this is the situation in the world today. A huge number of people are producing. We saw this graph last time that the laborers' productivity is going up like the stars, and the payment to the laborers is just flat. So basically all of the productive output is being captured by the top 1%, and that's why you see that massive increase in inequality. But this concept has been disappeared from the economists, just like our disappeared people. So this has been sent off to Guantanamo, and nobody can learn about this rentier if you look at the economics textbooks of today. It's not mentioned. So previously it was very well understood that people who speculate in land, they cause damage to society, and as stocks also, the stocks become expensive, and this is just but there is no value added. This is just a kind of a gambling. But now the finance lobby has caused this concept to disappear also, and now they talk about the creation of wealth. So if you buy a lot of land and it doubles in value, you have created wealth. This is nonsense. It is not true. This wealth is sort of a illusion, and this half of this wealth disappeared when the global financial took place, because it's just a balloon. It has no meaning. But the point that I'm trying to make here is that the terminology, the concepts, the framing, that is the word framing, the way that instead of talking about rentiers earning unjustified money, we talk about the creation of wealth. So it actually, you're saying the same thing, but you're framing it in such a way that something which is bad now looks like it is good. I have also a paper on the battle for the control of money. We'll get to that later. But basically what it shows is that one of the key things that we need to understand about, in order to understand macroeconomics, is the role of money. So there are several barriers, not one, that have been placed in the path of the student who wants to understand how money works. One of them is the idea that money is a whale, quantity theory of money. Money is neutral. Money doesn't matter. So just get rid of it. So, of course, money is very important, and if you think money doesn't matter, you can't understand it. But the second obstacle, if you start to understand that yes, money does matter, then the role of banks is deliberately concealed, and students are taught the wrong theory about what banks do. And actually the crucial thing about money is who creates money and who benefits from the creation of money. So these questions are given the wrong answers in the textbooks, and so you never find out who creates money and who benefits from it. So all of these are aspects of deliberate deception which make it very difficult for people. So we were saying that there's a huge amount of confusion about macro. So part of the confusion is because people don't know, don't have the education, but even larger part of the confusion comes because people are miseducated. They are educated into believing the wrong things, and this is done to protect the interests of those people who benefit from the existing system. So when the global financial crisis occurs, it was a great opportunity, because it made clear to the whole world that the economists don't understand what is going on, because it took the whole profession by surprise. All major macroeconomic theories, none of them, there are maybe 9 different schools of thought. There are textbooks we discuss different schools of macroeconomic thought, but not one of them was able to predict the crisis, and all of them were taken by surprise, because all of them believe that money is neutral. Once money is neutral, then banks are basically out of the picture. So banks play no role. They are what you call financial intermediaries. So the common impression, which we will see is wrong, is that banks collect the money from the depositors, and they take this money and they give it as loans to the creditors. So in a sense they are just intermediaries, and so from theoretical point of view you can ignore the banks. You can say, okay, the people who have the money, they lend directly to the people who need it, and the banks are just facilitating. So in a broad macroeconomic perspective, you can ignore banks safely because they're not really doing anything significant. But actually the banks don't function like this. The banks actually create money, and because of that the money supply is governed by actions of the banks, and the money supply is very important in the economy. It's not neutral. So the existing theories which treat banks as intermediaries and don't deal with the creation of money cannot understand why the global financial crisis took place. Now, the thing is that after the Great Depression, Keynes came up with a new theory, and Fisher came up with a debt deflation theory, and economists had to think that our theories were wrong and something has to change. And change was made, and Keynesian theory became accepted. But in the 1970s, the Chicago School basically led a counter-revolution which rejected Keynesian theory and basically resurrected the entire theory just as it was before Keynes, with very minor differences. This was a very well-planned campaign. There are papers which discuss how this campaign was planned. There was a Mount Pelerin Society, and there were many other think tanks which were created, and to create this free market thought. And they understood, they were very wise and patient. They understood that our ideas will not sell at this time because there is a lot of prosperity for about 40-50 years. The Keynesian theory told us how you can create full employment, and it was followed, and there was virtually full employment all over the Western world. So while people are prosperous and there is no economic problems, they could not sell their system. So they were waiting for an opportunity, and that is the shock doctrine. So the shock occurred in 1970s, and then they stepped in and said that, look, this problems are all due to Keynesian theory, and we can fix it by using free market methods. And they used lots of things. They created this artificial Nobel Prize in economics, which is not really a genuine Nobel Prize. It is fun. It's actually the Sveriges Riksbank Prize in the memory of Alfred Nobel. It was not the genuine Nobel Prizes owned and operated by the family of Alfred Nobel. This was just named. This was a prize created by a bank and funded by banks, and named after Nobel. Actually, the Nobel family protested against this appropriation of his name. But anyway, they created this Nobel Prize, and then they started giving it one after the other. Every other Nobel Prize is given to a Chicago school economist. So ultimately, this school, which in 1970s was, when I was going to graduate school, it was considered a quackpot school. It became the dominant orthodoxy, and Keynesians became the crackpots. So they became dominant, but they were prepared for this crisis this time, unlike the last time. So unlike the last time, where the Great Depression led to a real revolution in economic thought, not much has changed after the global financial crisis. Before the global financial crisis, there was complacency. Many economists said that we have solved the problem of business cycles. There will be no more recessions. We now know why recessions are formed and how to prevent them. But after that, there has been not much change. The same models, same economic models, same macro theories that were dominant before the global financial crisis continue to be dominant afterwards. And this is a bit surprising, that they have so much control. So basically, part of this article that we are studying is, how did this happen? How does the macroeconomic theory have so much power over the minds of people that people are continuing to believe in theories which are obviously false? So basically, the public has been conditioned to use models to think about the world which make falsehoods appear as truth. So because of this, the article is about why has modern monetary theory, which provides a solution and an explanation of many of the phenomena that people are struggling to understand, still nobody is paying much attention to it. So basically, the article is about trying to explain why modern macro theory, as taught in textbooks all over the world, is completely wrong, but it continues to be taught, while a good, sound, viable alternative is not getting any attention. So, as we already said, that key macro terms are misunderstood by economists, experts, journalists, and public, and this misunderstanding is exploited by the 1% to serve their interests and to support policies which favor a tiny minority and go against the interest of the general public. And the public is miseducated to vote for policies and to accept ideas that are actually harmful to their own interests. A big example is Trump, who was the poor people of America, who are suffering even more due to his policies, support him because they think that his economic policies will bring benefits to them. Basically, you see, the problems of the poor people are caused by the capitalist system which is exploiting them, but Trump made it appear that the problems are caused by the foreign trade and the Chinese labor and the cheap labor, and I will protect you from the foreigners and the immigrants and the Mexicans who are causing you problems. And so, by misdirecting and misconceiving who the enemy is, the public was made to support policies which are actually quite harmful to their interests, and they are not looking at the real source of their problems. The same thing happened in Brexit in England, where the English public, which was suffering from the effects of the European Monetary Union, which is definitely a harmful thing, as we will see, but the solution was not to exit the solution, because that has its own costs, but the sophisticated analysis required to analyze the problem and solve it was not available. So the public supported policies which were not actually in their own best interest. Same thing happened in Greece, same thing happened in Turkey, similar things are happening in Pakistan. So the article says that there are two visions of the economy, the framing. One is that the market is all powerful, it's an automatic machine, and everything is embedded within the market, exactly as we said. So we just have to go along with the will of the market, and if we do so, then it will produce good results for all of us. And all of the problems are caused by our interference with the markets. If we just let the market be free, all good things will automatically come about. As opposed to this, the other vision, which was the pre-Great Transformation, was that the market is something that's quite harmful and dangerous, and it has to be controlled and governed. And this is very much in line with the Islamic vision. The Prophet Muhammad said that the masajid are the best places and the markets are the worst places. And from day one, there has been an institution in Islam which is called Hisbah, which does many things in the public interest, but one of these things is called the regulation of markets. So many things like control of monopolies, externalities, and many problems of the market which economists are discovering today are explicitly taken into account in Islamic teachings and are prevented from happening. So when there is an inspector of the markets, and once Umar Radhiyallahu Ta'ala was asked a person who was running a store that, have you learned the Sharia, the laws of the market? And he said no. Then he said, you can't run a shop until you go and learn the rules. Today the Muslims, whether they are shopkeepers or whether they are not, nobody knows the rules of the marketplace. What are the laws? One of the simple ones is that you cannot deceive people, that if you have a concealed hidden defect, you must reveal that defect to the customer. As opposed to this, the American rule is that let the buyer beware. If I am selling you my used car and it has some defect, it is your job to find out that there is some defect. It is not my job to tell you. I am trying to deceive you and get the best possible price. So these are the differences between the capitalist ethics and the Islamic ethics. So today we are all living in a market society, as I've explained earlier. So the rules of the market govern, and slowly the markets are taking over. In the US, they have cases where the children have sued their parents for bad parenting, and there are articles in economics journals about the cost benefit of children, how much money you invest in them and how much money you get back from them. So now for us, children are not subject to cost benefit calculations until now. But tomorrow somebody will have this idea, because if the West is doing it, it must be good. So we must follow this. So the key messages of modern monetary theory are that market forces cannot deliver full employment, and that markets are operating within societies. So unemployment is not something that you can tolerate, that unemployment will eliminate itself eventually, because it has huge human cost. People cannot find jobs, they cannot feed their families. In America, studies show that unemployment, especially among the blacks, was very high, and that led to a very breakup of families, loss of self-esteem on part of the males who couldn't find jobs, so they were not able to fulfill the roles that society has given them, that you are supposed to feed and protect the family. If they couldn't do that, that led to loss of self-confidence, drinking, many drugs, many other kinds of socially irresponsible behavior. And again, because the loss of jobs, it led to the children not being cared for, and many other. It's not just joblessness is not just not having money. It has a huge social cost. So you can't just say, okay, don't worry, the market will find a job for everybody eventually at the going wage rate, and be indifferent to this problem. So government interventions are necessary to enable the markets to function well. Markets don't function in the labor market, so we need to make sure that the rules and regulations are in place. One of the key messages which is surprising is that the government deficit is exactly equal to the private sector surplus. We've discussed this already earlier. Otherwise, so when you talk about, as you will see, you will read in newspaper columns every day that, government is running a huge deficit. Well, it means that the private sector is running a huge surplus. All of these messages that we discussed here are contrary to widely believed myths of the free market. So if we start saying this in public, no one will believe us. If you start going out and saying that government deficit is good, you watch the reaction. They will say that they are teaching crazy things at PIDE. Actually, we will, so don't say that. So, free market propaganda has been going on since the 1970s. There's this paper called Winning Ideas by Alcaire and Foster, which describes in detail how the free market ideology went from being a small minority considered quacks by everybody to the dominant majority. So it didn't happen all by itself. There was a lot of things that needed to be done to create this great transformation within economic theory, and this paper describes some of them. The shock doctrine by Naomi Klein describes the world economy and how what were the steps that were taken to impose free market by deception and by force all over the world. So this book, actually I have said about it often that everything I learned in my PhD in economics in Stanford, put that on one side and put the shock doctrine on the other side. Naomi Klein gives you more information about economics and 20th century economics, then a PhD from Stanford in economics will. So among these things there's the Powell memo, which was written when he was, there was some case which was outrageous in favor of corporations, that the corporations were allowed to spend money, and this was considered as free speech. I've forgotten the details, but anyway, that case was lost in the 1970s in favor of the public and against the capitalists. So Powell was very shocked, and he said that America is becoming anti-capitalist and we have to do something. And so he crafted a strategy that business should, so far business has been staying away from politics, that the head of the American Business Council was in New York, which was the center of business. We should move to Washington. So they moved to Washington. They started subsidizing senatorial campaigns. They started crafting a political image, and since then, basically, a study by a political scientist done recently shows that in any measure in which the public interest, in the interest of the large corporations, is opposed, the corporations win the vote in the Senate. A simple example which is common to all is that every day there are children who are shot up in the USA by people with guns, and so the obvious solution is to ban the use of guns. This used to happen in Australia, and after a big shooting, Australia banned guns, and since then there has never been any shooting. But in the USA, the same bill cannot even be introduced in Congress. It's not that the issue of introducing a bill and discussed, but as any person, it is considered poisonous. If somebody was to even introduce a bill, he would not be able to get the money to run his campaign. So basically the business has taken over the politics. And the Powell memo outlines how we should make a campaign to support free markets by taking over the politics and taking over the media. Now the media itself is also, and there is this novel called The Brave New World, which is very popular these days because it describes what is coming true today. It describes how these people basically rewrite history completely, and they rewrite language so that certain thoughts become unthinkable because the word for it, that thought, does not exist in the language anymore. So to give a very simple example, Chomsky uses this concept that when the Vietnam War was going on, there were two sides in America. One was the picture was that the America is defending freedom by the battle in Vietnam. So there was the hawks who said that it is our responsibility to defend freedom when it's threatened in any corner of the world. And the doves said that no, we should not defend freedom if it requires us to go out to Vietnam. But the idea that we are actually a colonizing power and this cannot be expressed. It's not on the spectrum of the ideas available. So there was a big fight over sort of a non-issue, and the main issue is simply not available to discuss. So this is the power of framing. So there are two positions, the doves and the hawks, but the real position is not on the table for discussion. So this is how framing works. So the problem in front of us is that, this whole article is about that. The sun is shining and I am putting out a theory that it is midnight and it is dark and nobody can see anything. And people are believing it, and we are discussing how in the dark we should invent torches and how batteries can be used and how candles work. And I am saying, look, the sun is shining. So there is something to explain. How can people close their eyes to reality in such a such a big way. So I have an article on this which is called Radical Paradigm Shifts, which explains how this kind of things happen. But basically the point in this article is that the world is not directly observable. You see, when eyes see, they only see points of light. The picture that we construct is done by the software in the brain, which takes these points. If you have seen the matrix, so you see these bit streams, ones and zeros. That's what the world is like, ones and zeros. Now you have to code this. So this coding is done by our brains. So this coding is done according to theories. So these theories, so we don't really directly see the sun. It is our interpretation which we have learned. You see, that when the baby is born into the world, she doesn't know that there is a sun and there is a moon. She can see patterns of light, but then she learns to understand the world. So this learning, if it is corrupted, then you don't see the sun even if it's shining. So basically, we cannot see the world directly. We see the world only through models, and all models are wrong. So automatically, the word for model is metaphor. We think in terms of analogy by simple models. We don't see, and these simple models can then be used to deceive us. And with this, if the model doesn't contain any rentier class, then we cannot think about the rentier class. If the model tells us that everybody is earning their marginal products, then that's how we think. So now the article goes on to discuss 10 myths which are common and widespread in modern macro, which are refuted by modern monetary theory. So we will discuss these 10 myths. So the first myth is that the government budget constraint is like the household budget constraint. If I don't have money, I can't buy anything in the marketplace. It's just very simple. I can borrow things, but that's not a very good idea, because if I start borrowing, then I will have to pay it back. You know, we all know people that go to the shop and say, okay, put this on my account, but someday he will stop selling them things and say, okay, please bring me the money for the... So we think by analogies, by metaphors, just like a household cannot spend in excess, so the government cannot run a deficit. But this is not true. The government does not have a budget constraint like that of the public, because the government is the creator of money. So the government can print as much money as it likes. So it is not like households. Now it's a separate question. What will happen if the government prints a lot of money? So actually I have an article on modern monetary theory which I have put on the website, which explains that the issues, there are some costs to printing money and there are benefits. So you have to, but the traditional theory doesn't take this into account, doesn't think of this as being a cost-benefit proposition. It just says that government should have balanced budgets just like the household. So this idea is completely wrong. So now when we start thinking about the government can print as much money as it likes, then you have to do a realistic assessment. What are the costs? Because you have been prevented from thinking about this, and what are the benefits, and then at what point do they balance? So these are the issues that you need to think about if you want to, but not that government should not have deficits, which is what the standard storyline that you see in newspapers. So the second myth is that fiscal deficits are bad. So as the article says, and as this framing article says, the government deficit equals the private sector surplus. So deficits are not by themselves good or bad. Deficits can be good if they are undertaken as a part of a policy to create full employment. They can be bad if they signal poor governance, in which the government is unable to collect taxes and is spending wastefully. But the point is that even more important than these is that government deficit is not a exogenous variable that you can control it to whatever level you want. Deficits are driven by factors often outside the control of the government. So, because of this, that's not the place to look if you want to control the economy. There are other things the government needs to be doing, and when you do that, then some level of deficit will emerge as a result. So it's an endogenous variable, and the value of the deficit, the number, whether it's $1 trillion like in the US or whether it's plus, it's not relevant. I mean, the size of the deficit, whether it's huge, what is the ratio of deficit to GNP, these numbers don't matter at all. These are irrelevant red herrings which are part of the daily discourse of newspapers. There is a misconception, this is the third myth, I think, that if the government can save money to spend it, so if I run a budget surplus, then I will have money and then I can use it to build the Bhasha Dam, for example. So again, this is not correct. The government, this is again based on the analogy with the household, that if I want to buy something big, I have to save money from my income and then I have to buy it. The government, basically, savings at the government level does not mean saving money, because think about it. Suppose I want 1 billion rupees. So am I going to save I can print 1 billion rupees now and put it in a box and say, here's my saving, and tomorrow I produce it and now I saved 1 billion rupees. So it makes no sense to talk about the government saving money for the future, because the government is the creator of money. So saving still has a meaning, but what is the meaning of that saving? It means that we need resources, like we need cement, we need concrete, we need steel in order to build the dam, we need machines, we need tractors, we need labor. So savings means that if you don't have the resources, if you have all the resources now, then you can just build. It's not that I don't have money to hire laborers and to buy the steel, because the government, if as long as these are domestically available resources, there is no resource constraint. However, if something is available in the USA, then we do have a constraint, because I don't have dollars. I can print rupees, but I cannot print dollars. So then that's more complicated. We will discuss how we deal with international trade. But for domestic resources, if all the resources are available, I can just start building today. Even if the government has a $1 billion deficit, it doesn't matter. As long as the resources are available, we can start building, because the deficit is not the control. Now, that is not how the government thinks. The government thinks that I have a $1 trillion deficit, a $1 billion deficit, I cannot spend more money. But that's the wrong way of thinking. So savings for the future means that suppose I don't have enough cement, then I can stockpile cement and say that, okay, until I get resources. But some resources can be saved, but some cannot. The labor cannot be saved. So if you don't use labor, then it's wasted. So that is the most important goal of the government, to not waste resources. So there are laws everywhere that the government should balance its budget. Even in Pakistan, we have that the budget deficit should not be above a certain number. So government deficits are actually an endogenous variable. They're determined by tax revenues, by growths, by exports, imports, and other factors. So it is not really something that you can control. Now there is a meaning. There is a reason that this type of law is passed. This reason also makes a lot of sense. If the politicians are told that you can spend as much as you like, then they will print money for wasteful purposes. So the issue is that The point is to prevent the political system from doing wasteful expenditure. For that we have to have good governance. But it is not an issue of balanced budget. Even if you balance the budget, the politicians will find ways to finance their wasteful expenditures, and the problem will be that if the government wants to spend money wisely on things that are necessary, like is happening today, that we want to spend to provide for health care, to provide for nutrition for children, to provide for education, and people think there is no money to do that. It's not the issue of whether or not there is money to do that. The issue is whether or not we have the resources. Do we have teachers? Do we have schools? Do we have children? If we have all of that, then that's fine. So the idea that we should have balanced budget laws is a fallacy, a myth, a misconception. A very common myth is that fiscal deficits lead to crowding out. So if the government borrows money from the banks, then the money will not be available to the public for investment. Now, the fact of the matter is that another argument similar to this is that if we borrow a lot, the interest rates will rise, and it will make it more difficult for the public to borrow. It will make it more expensive. Now, the interest rate is not governed by the size of the deficit. The government does not need to borrow from the private sector. It can borrow from state bank and thereby not interfere with the public sector. And in addition, the banks create money that they lend. So if the bank lends money to the government, it doesn't mean that now it has less money to lend to the private sector. So none of these objections to fiscal deficits are valid. Quite often, when you go into more deeply, it depends on the type of borrowing that you do. For example, if we want to run a factory which produces cement, then private sector factories will be adversely affected. If we run the steel mill, which is at a scale which is so large that the private sector cannot enter, then this will actually be an investment which will cause crowding in, because of the availability of steel, a lot of other investment will take place. So the basic myths are wrong and the reality is quite different. Then there is this famous Ricardian equivalence. This Stiglitz says that Ricardian equivalence is taught in every graduate school in the country. It is also sheer nonsense. There is this idea that if I have a large deficit, I have to pay for it by raising taxes in the future. In fact, Ricardian equivalence, which to the best of my knowledge was never actually said by David Ricardo, that the amount of deficit that you run today must be exactly compensated for by the taxes that you collect later. This is complete nonsense, as Stiglitz says. Nothing to do with anything. In 1996, William Vickrey, who was actually at Columbia when I was there teaching with me, he was received a Nobel in 1996, and in his speech he said that deficits are considered to represent sinful spending at the expense of future generations who will be left with a smaller endowment of investment capital. We are borrowing from the future in some sense, and this fallacy seems to stem from a false analogy to borrowing by individual. Current reality is almost exact opposite. Deficits add to the net disposable of income of individuals. So basically, again, this fundamental truth Then there is the idea that government has a certain amount of revenue, and that is called the fiscal space, the amount of money that I have to spend on social programs. So government say that we asked the government that why don't we have social services? Why don't we make sure that everybody can eat? So the government says, I don't have enough money to buy food for the people. So there is no fiscal space. And in order to get that fiscal space, I have to raise the taxes. And increasing the tax to budget ratio is a major priority for the government, that if we can get more revenues, then we will have the money, then we can spend on the people, then we can create projects. So this is again wrong. Once you understand this, then you understand that taxes are not meant for raising revenues at all. You can do zero taxation and raise all the revenue you want from printing money. So basically then, the issue is not one of where to get the money, which is how it is framed. The issue is how much money should there be and in whose hands should it be. So if the government prints a lot of money and the private sector has a lot of money, they will be both competing for scarce resources, which will drive up the price of resources, which may be a desirable outcome. We don't know. And maybe you want to drive up the price of resources so that more is produced. It depends on what kind of what you call capacity constraints are there. If the capacity constraints are soft, then you want to compete, and then you want to drive up the prices so that more producers enter the field. Now, if the thing that you are trying to buy is fixed and limited in nature and you have inelastic supply, then it might be a problem. But basically, taxes are a way to redistribute income, to basically reduce private sector aggregate demand and to transfer it into the hands of the public. Maybe you want to direct the investment. Public is going out and spending money on land and speculation and property which is not productive. You should tax it and take it away from them and use that money to do productive investments. But anyway, all of these questions don't even come up for discussion because you're not even thinking. You see, as I said, there are multiple barriers, not one, in order to get to reality of macroeconomics. So you have to step over one before you can start thinking about what does taxation really do and whether it's useful or not. Today, because you're thinking in the wrong terms, so you can't even get to the questions which need to be asked. So again, the quantity theory teaches you that if the government prints money, then there will be rampant inflation. So, as I've said, nobody actually knows the causes of inflation. And the relationship between money and inflation used to be quite stable until the 70s. But in the 70s, after the financial lobby got its way, they started printing money like crazy. But inflation didn't happen. So the relationship between money and inflation is not very tight. So once you understand that, then you have to look for what are the causes of inflation. So basically, there is short-run inflation, long-run inflation. This all depends on production capacity. So in a sector in which you have large amount of production capacity, if you spend money in that sector, then temporarily there will be in the short run inflation, but that inflation is good because as the prices rise, more capacity will be drawn into the sector. So we want inflation in that situation. We want to absorb the excess capacity which is lying idle because the prices are too low. So by pushing money into that sector and causing inflation, this is something that is good. We want to have the prices rise so that our capacity, the unutilized capacity which is lying idle because the prices are too low, will become used. So the idea that inflation is always bad is also a wrong idea. So government spending is inflationary. Again, the idea, again, this is, see lots of myths have been created, and they are all support each other. So 1, 2, 3, all of them you have to remove at the same time before you can get to the reality. So the idea that the government spending is inflation just means that you shouldn't overspend. The government should control its deficit, and if you don't, if you have a large deficit, then the deficit will not be sustainable. Again, that word is meaningless, because all deficits are sustainable, because you can always print money to finance your deficit. Now there is a caveat here, that when you get to a foreign deficit, then things are problematic, because you can't print dollars. So so now, what is about this inflationary? Well, all of spending is inflationary, because if you have a sector which has a limited capacity to produce, see, remember your production theory that marginal costs are constant. So if you have idle capacity, if you spend more, it will not cause a rise in prices. But if you reach the limits of the capacity of the industry, then it will cause a rise in prices, and then that will lead to an increase in the capacity. The firms will expand their production capacity. So the cure for inflation is to increase the productive capacities of economy. Hyperinflations in Germany and Zimbabwe, everybody gives the example of how, and when you mention this theory, everybody will say that, the hyperinflation, Germany printed a lot of money and that caused a hyperinflation. But that is not the primary cause of the hyperinflation. This is a long and complicated discussion. In this article, just mentioned that there was a dramatic loss in productive capacity in Germany, and that was because of the war. It destroyed and because of the lack of productive capacity, there were just too little goods. So no matter how much money you spent, you cannot. The goods aren't there to buy. So, and that was the reason for the hyperinflation, and not the printing of money. Another common myth is that big deficits lead to big government. So, and big government is bad. Actually, the size of the deficit we want to run relates to our economic goals. Even a small government can run a big deficit if it wants to achieve full employment. The size of the government we have is a political choice. And today, the serious problem with Pakistan doesn't have to do with big government or small government. It has to do with the colonial tradition. The government was set up for one purpose, the colonial government. It was set up to extract revenue from the people and send it to Britain. So the exact same structures, institutional, and the exact same ways of thinking are prevalent. So, and that is the source, the reason for the bad governance that we see. The bureaucrats think that they are the lords of the land. Their job is not to provide services to the people, but rather to assert their authority over people, because they are the part of the ruling class, the kings and the. So because of that, and their goal is to extract revenue, and instead of sending it to Britain, it is distributed to the various stakeholders, the political parties and the others who are rich and powerful. So that is the job of the government in Pakistan today, to extract revenue from the people and to share it, distribute it among themselves. So, alright, so as I said earlier, in the post-crisis time, unlike the post-Great Depression, where new ideas came out, the capitalists were well prepared that this is going to happen, and they handled the narrative. They made sure that the public didn't start thinking dangerous thoughts like the right macro theories. So, very surprising, there was no change in macro. Keynesian economics was invented, but this time there is no new macro theories coming up. Actually, there is massive discontent after the global financial crisis. Romer has written this article, Trouble with Macroeconomics, which we are going to study next time. Krugman says that wrote an article, what went wrong, and he says the profession as a whole went astray because they mistook the beauty of mathematics for truth. So he says that there is something called mathiness, where you use math everywhere, even where it's not called for. Solo, in a testimony before the Congress, the fact that economic theory has failed was clear to everybody from top to bottom. The common public understood that economic theory is wrong, even though they don't know anything about economic theory. The Queen of England went to London School of Economics and said, why didn't you guys tell me this was going to happen? Why did no one know? So, in the Congress testimony, Solo testified that DSGE models, which are currently being used for policy making all over the planet, are not meant for this planet. The assumptions they make are so crazy that they are suitable for Mars but not for Earth. But, there is a very important but. Even though all of these economists said these things, and even though everybody recognizes that macro is wrong, surprise, surprise, nobody is asking for change. Solo says that I think that the body of economic analysis that we have piled up and teach is pretty good. There is no need to turn it in any wholesale way, and no acceptable suggestion for doing so. Krugman, I am open-minded, I can make a few criticisms, but basically I am a maximization and equilibrium kind of guy. So, no, even though the crisis shook a few leaves from the top, there is no change in the foundations. No one is questioning the foundation. So, lots of people, we can find lots and lots of quotes. I once compiled them that DSG is crazy model, we don't know anything about macro, everything. Very, very strong and powerful statements. But in the same article, the author says, yes, all of these things are there, but what is the option? We have solid, sound foundation, so we just have to build upon them, correct our mistakes, and go on. So people make harsh criticisms and then they walk it back, as they say in the slang, that they go back on it. So today, business as usual. The $1 trillion bailout was given to the banks who caused the crisis. Bonuses were paid to the criminal bankers who had actually committed fraud. There was only one country, I think it was Finland, that they jailed the bankers. Otherwise, fraud was proven against these bankers, but they received minor slaps on the arm. They said, okay, you pay $1 billion fine and we will lend you $1 billion at zero interest, so you can pay the fine easily. Arch-Gauch models, which were used for predicting volatility, failed miserably in the GFC. They continue to be used. DSG, RBC models, which were in use in our state bank and all over the world, are continuing to be used. The private debt crisis, you see, what we have studied is that basically the deflation debt theory is the right theory of deflation. It's basically the huge debts which led to the global financial crisis, household debt. And that was the same was true in the Great Depression, but this has been misrepresented. Nobody is talking about the level of, this was the basic contribution of the book Atif Mia and Amir Sufi, House of Debt. But amazingly, even though they have a very accurate analysis, even though book has become a bestseller, even though it's widely known, this is not being taught in macro because it doesn't mesh with the standard story. If you want to teach the story of debt, then you have to get rid of all of these myths and you have to start from zero, and nobody wants to do that. So they say, okay, let's see, we have our model, we can introduce debt as an extra variable. That's how this is done, how this magic is done, we will discuss in the Trouble with Macro next lecture. So instead what happened was that they said that, you see, after the economy collapsed, then there was a sovereign debt crisis that countries were, because countries were holding money and holding these huge billions of dollars worth of American securities, which were going down and had value zero. So they were holding reserves in these, and they had this debt crisis. So the attention, European Union had problems and other places. So the attention was diverted. The economists started saying that what we have is a sovereign debt crisis. So the real causes, so the government are in trouble. So the real causes were covered up. The household debt crisis doesn't get mentioned. So Mia and Sufi in House of Debt point out that it is the levels of debt that led to the crisis, and they mention that there are two theories in their book. They discuss that there is the theory that this is a banking crisis, and there is a theory that this is a household debt crisis. So they say that the action was taken on the basis of the wrong diagnosis that what we are facing is a banking crisis. So what happened was that $1 trillion bailout was given to the banks. And if the correct diagnosis had been made that it's a household debt crisis, the same bailout, much less bailout, would have been enough to save the households and to prevent the Great Recession. But this was not done because of the wrong theory which dominates the minds. And again, this is not a wrong theory, it doesn't dominate by accident, by mistake, but because this theory was pushed, because it was the theory that favors the interests of the finance lobby. So people have been studying these recessions. So basically they find that this Glick and Lansing study in 2010 found that the countries with the largest increase in household debt had the largest increase in aggregate demand after the crisis. And aggregate demand is the source of the recession. So basically the debt is tied to the aggregate demand. This is something that even Keynes missed. So Keynes got to the point understanding that aggregate demand declines, but he didn't realize that the aggregate demand declines due to the debt. So basically the key finding of a lot of different research is that it is high household debt which leads to recessions. In Marvin King, a governor of Bank of England, in 1994 he wrote that the most severe recessions occurred in those countries which had experienced the largest increase in private debt burdens. Similarly, recently Reinhardt and Rogoff have written a paper which has been very influential and popular, in which they looked at 150 crises and they traced them all to banking crises. So this Reinhardt-Rogoff paper supports the idea that the banking crisis is responsible for the global financial crisis, and so we should save the banks to prevent crises. But a reanalysis by Jordache, Shurlalik and Taylor, who looked over 200 recessions in 14 countries between 1870 and 2008, they find that the level of household crisis debt was a critical factor. When you have banking crisis together with household debt, then you get into a deep recession. When you have banking crisis alone, no household debt, it's a minor recession. It recovers quickly. If you have large household debt, no banking crisis, again you get into a recession, but again it's not as severe as when the two of them combine. So when the two of them combine, then you really get a huge problem. So but the thing is that the crucial factor is that economic disasters are almost always preceded by large increase in household debt. So that is the crucial factor, not the banking crisis. So the dominant narrative today is that there was a banking crisis which led to a sovereign debt crisis, and this happened because after the East Asian crisis, central banks all over the world, after the East Asian crisis, the East Asian countries, Thailand and Indonesia, Malaysia, Singapore, they all had huge amounts of foreign investment, and this foreign money was suddenly withdrawn like a vacuum. So they had huge liabilities in foreign exchange which they could not fulfill. So learning this lesson that central banks all over the world started building up their foreign dollar reserves. Now the way to build reserves is to buy treasury bonds, but treasury was paying almost nothing. So American clever investors like Warren Buffett and others, they came up with this trick and trap. They packaged these mortgage securities into attractive looking bundles, had them certified as AAA, which was actually a fraud, and they sold them. And so the foreign banks said, okay, we can hold our dollars in these mortgage-backed securities, and then we will earn a good return on this money, and also we will have our dollar reserves. But when these mortgage bank securities collapsed, then there was a sovereign debt crisis. So this became the story line, and the household debt, which is at the back of this, why did the mortgage crisis occur? That was due to the household debt burden that was taken out of the picture. So now the last part of the article is about, well, all of these myths dominate the public discourse. So what can we do about it? So how can we create change? Well, we have to educate the public, we have to change the metaphors, we have to change the models in use. When we say that government should not run a deficit, when the deficit is used to finance social sector programs, then we should focus on the effect that the government should not waste resources which are lying idle. A human being is a very precious resource that we have available, and we should try to employ all of them, even if it means spending. We should talk about the purpose instead of the path, because the government should not have deficit. Well, that's just high deficit, low deficit. It's meaningless. It's a step towards the goal. So we talk about the goal. What should the government be trying to do? The government should be trying to provide justice. It should be trying to provide health, whatever it takes in terms of deficit. So talk about the purposes, because there is agreement on purposes. People say that yes, we should have full employment, we should feed our people, we should provide health care, we should provide education. There is consensus on this. Now if it takes a deficit to do so, let it be. So we should change the metaphors in use. Instead of talking about government deficit, we should talk about government investment in the future. So when we invest in the future, we can borrow. And this is a metaphor. If I want to educate my children, he has gotten admission into LUMS, but I don't have enough money, so I will borrow from my friends that, okay, this is a good investment. So then we can paint the deficit in a positive light. So the article says that maybe we should not talk about deficits altogether, we should invent a new term. And he says that no, we can't do that, because then if we do that, it will be too remote from, because the term is so common that this strategy is not a good strategy. So instead, then we have to paint the deficit as in positive terms. Because you can't get rid of this word, because if we start using some other word, people won't understand what we are saying. So we should fight metaphors with counter metaphors. We should talk about tax relief. The financial lobby talks about tax relief. Tax relief means less taxes for the wealthy. So instead of that, we should talk about unemployment relief. Use taxes to create full employment. Roosevelt, in the Great Depression, he managed this very well. He said, to balance our budget in 1933 would have been a crime against the American people. We accept the financial responsibility of the government to spend money when no one else had money left to spend. So this is an example of how you change the metaphor here. You change what, and the same thing could have been done. The government is being very irresponsible, and it was said, and running a huge deficit. They said, no, our responsibility is to the people. We want to make sure that their budgets are balanced, even if our budget becomes unbalanced. So the public deficit is the counterpart of the private surplus. Fiscal space is not about the money which the government has. It's about how much resources are lying idle. In particular, if there's unemployment, this is a crime. That to leave people unemployed means you are wasting resources. That's what should be striking the people. That how can we leave all of these people without work? They could all be working to produce a better Pakistan. So our urgent job becomes, so borrow money if necessary to make sure that they are working on something productive. Now, this is the last slide. The humility is essential for students. Remember that I know nothing. Yani your attitude should be, I know nothing. I am just learning things. This should not enter into your belief system that these are the things to believe. You are just tasting ideas which are different. One set of ideas is coming from one place, and I am giving you another set of ideas. You should hold and know both of them, and you should not be the judge at this time. You are too young and too innocent and too immature and lack too much knowledge. Because I am saying this from experience, because my students go out into meeting in which big economists are saying, hey, everything you're saying is wrong. So that's really rude. And furthermore, when they say, okay, prove it, they don't know how to prove it. You have just heard some words from me. You do not have the knowledge. Now I am giving you a direction. If you study hard, you learn what the arguments are from the classical side, you learn then you may be able to say that yes, your theory is correct. At this time, all you can say is that you are saying fiscal deficits are bad, but I have heard that they might be good in some circumstances. And Mitchell, Ray and Falana have written in their book that in some situations, then they will listen to you. You say, oh, you are all wrong. And I am saying this because it has happened. It's not that that my students go out and act in a very irresponsible way. So here you have to be very careful. I have given you very powerful and very important knowledge, but actually you haven't received, don't have this knowledge. You have just listened to a lecture about this. If you acquire this knowledge, then it will be useful for you. But you have to put in the effort to get the knowledge. So you are the seeker of knowledge. You're not the owner of knowledge at this time. But if you seek, then you will find, inshallah.